In today's webinar, Protecting Your Brand in the Chinese Market, we'll be discussing proven best practices to keep brand assets secure in the vast and rapidly changing Chinese market. Let me take a minute to introduce our speakers for today's presentation. Both are MarkMonitor experts, Zach Wolf and Trevor Robbins. Trevor is a brand protection client services manager at MarkMonitor. In addition to building brand protection programs for his clients and providing Chinese marketplace guidance, he's also worked closely with MarkMonitor's anti-piracy, training, and strategic services groups. He started his career as a federal worker in Washington, D.C., and applies an international background towards providing innovative and effective IP protection strategies that effectively disrupt illegitimate online activities infringing on the trademarks, products, or services of brand owners globally. Zach is the product marketing manager for MarkMonitor's anti-counterfeiting solutions. Over 4 years of experience in brand protection, he's focused on building a comprehensive, effective brand protection strategy for global brands in various industries, including technology, apparel, sports, and entertainment. Zach has managed a team of brand protection analysts and helped establish industry-standard anti-counterfeiting best practices across multiple digital channels. So with that, I'll turn things over to Zach to get us started.
Great, thank you very much, Ian, for that introduction. So we're going to jump right into it with a quote that I always like by Chanel. You know, they are one of, if you know, the most iconic brands in the world, and this quote, you know, really always stands out to me, especially as we talk, you know, anti-counterfeiting. If you want to be original, be ready to be copied. And you know, the majority of the brands that we work with, I would say all of the brands actually, the folks on the phone, you know, certainly you've reached a level where, you know, people are looking to take advantage of your brand and work off the equity, you know, time, money, and passion that you've spent. So, you know, certainly that originality comes with a bit of a price, and some of that is, you know, looking to be copied. So here is the agenda for today. You know, certainly if we're going to talk about best practices in brand protection in the Chinese market, we should establish why the Chinese market is important. There is some facts and figures that we'll provide for you that really go to show and highlight just how massive an influence the Chinese market is, not only on global e-commerce, but, you know, specifically counterfeit and infringing product. I think that there's a general consensus when we talk brand protection that, you know, kind of China is the outstanding issue, but I think it's surprising when you dig into some of the numbers, just how dominant a factor they are when it comes to this overall landscape. Then we're going to move into some opportunities and challenges. So along with the challenges that the Chinese market provides when it comes to brand protection and infringement, it also provides a lot of opportunity. And we'll kind of outline some of those opportunities that you may be able to take advantage of. And then we'll also, you know, kind of discuss how in your roles as leaders in brand protection within your company, you have the ability to, you know, leverage and work with other folks within your business to, you know, capitalize on the opportunities provided by the brand protection work. And we'll give a couple examples of those that we've seen to be very successful here at MarkMonitor. Third, the brand protection and enforcement strategy. So that's going to be, you know, the deep dive into a lot of the, you know, best practices, industry standards, things that we have seen, you know, over time that have worked really well. You know, as we've worked with a large number of companies, we've seen, you know, a lot of success stories, and we've been able to help a lot of folks that are just getting going. So Trevor will be kind enough to jump into a lot of those key takeaways. And then at the bottom, you know, if we're going to set up, you know, that China is very important, there's these opportunities and challenges, we want to make sure that we back that up with some case studies. So what we'll do is we'll walk you through 4 or 5 different cases of brands that we've worked with that have had a lot of success in China. And we'll talk about, you know, what they did, what they made sure to do as they built out their program. So with that, what we're going to do now to kind of, you know, get some folks engaged and really see, you know, where people are at as far as their perception of the challenge that they face in China, Ian is going to launch a poll. So when you see that pop out on your screen, feel free to choose the one that you think is most relevant as far as you gauging, you know, your perception of the challenge in China. So Ian, if you want to go ahead and launch that poll, that'd be great.
Yeah, thanks, Zach. So this is a poll where we're asking everybody on the line, take a moment, we'll only leave it up for 30 seconds or so, thinking of generally about Asian marketplaces. Where have you found counterfeits of your products, and how critically do you rank the challenge of solving the brand protection issues they represent? We'll have another poll later on in the webinar on a different topic, but the results are coming in right now, and I'll leave it up for just a few more seconds. And as Zach said, this is kind of an interesting, I think, feedback for all of you to see where your issues might rank. You might rank the severity of this issue against your peers in the various companies on the line. So give it 2 more seconds, 1 more second, and here are the results. We see, well, definitely very few people found it insignificant, or else you wouldn't be on the call, and very challenging. It's obviously a challenging issue. So that's where we are with that poll. There'll be another one in the middle of the webinar as we proceed. So with that, back to you, Zach and Trevor.
All right, thank you, Ian. And it looks like from that poll that there was one person who found China to be an insignificant challenge to them. So hopefully we can, you can still find at least one thing in this webinar to take away that'll be helpful. Unsurprisingly, the majority of folks on the line found that China was, very challenging or extremely challenging. And Trevor, I would say that's no surprise. As the majority of folks that we work with, that's a key strategic point of the programs that they run. So we're going to dive right into it. So why is the Chinese market important? There is a lot of facts and figures on this particular slide. I will highlight a few of them. Really, what we want to kind of impart with the importance of the Chinese market is just that overall dominance. So, 721 million internet users. The number of internet users is about 2 to 1 of the entire US population. So if we're talking overall e-commerce, before we even narrow it down into the online brand protection space, we're talking about a lot of people that are using the internet, that have access to e-commerce, that have access, unfortunately, to some of those infringing products as well. 40% of all internet users worldwide. Chinese online shoppers currently number more than 361 million. Again, if you juxtapose that with the entire population of the US, or if you're dialing in internationally, if you think of your own particular country and where your total population ranks versus Chinese online shoppers, I think it's pretty easy to tease out just how important this market is. Online sales outpace those of the US. So this was something that we found interesting. We are here local in the United States, so we do have a bit of a bias about the popularity of US e-commerce. In thinking, for the longest time, the US, the United States did lead that space, and now we've been overtaken by China. And then finally, doing a little projecting, this comes from a brand new report out by Goldman Sachs, 750 billion in e-commerce sales in the end of 2006, so the last financial reporting year. And they're projecting here in just a few short years in 2020 to be approaching $2 trillion in e-commerce sales. So again, not only if you take the population of your specific country and juxtapose that with how many people are shopping online, but if you look within your individual company, maybe you can take a look at your latest quarterly forecast, your revenue, market cap, whatever financials you use, you think that are the most relevant, and you can see, approaching 2 trillion in 2020. So pretty significant domination of, not only internet use, but e-commerce as well. Moving ahead, here are a couple reports from some industry standards that I think you guys will recognize. The first one on the left, of course, is from the Global IP Center. They're very helpful as we do our research into finding, then putting these types of webinars together. So you can see that pie chart right there in the middle. China, unsurprisingly, after the last slide, represents 72% of the top 10 economies in global physical counterfeiting. The other number that I would draw your eye to on that pie chart is the 8.76%. So that is representative of 37 economies that represent 85% of world trade. And I'll try and stay with me. It's it's kind of in the weeds a little bit, but they only represent 8.76 of physical counterfeiting. So even that alone, is kind of eye-opening to just how dominant China is when it comes to influencing the the global market of counterfeit goods. The two boxes that you see up there underneath the orange title, global physical counterfeiting, 461 to 40. So you can see by a number of magnitude the influence that China has. The chart that you see over there on the right goes through 2016. A couple things I would like to highlight there. Again, this is business to consumer e-commerce sales. So for now, we're staying still firmly in the realm of how the Chinese consumer base is influencing the purchasing power and the infringements that unfortunately they choose to purchase. The spike that you see there in 2010, 2011 through 12 and 13 is a huge jump. That's a ton of people coming online, going to the most popular sites that we'll touch on here in just a minute, and choosing to buy online. 2015, 16 and beyond, while the percentage does increase, the overall number is quite large. So you can see between those two charts, China influences the global market on a huge scale when it comes to counterfeiting, and you have a huge scale of people in China that are online shopping. So as you talk about the market, if you're looking at your own brand protection program and you say, okay, we're a global brand and we've got global problems, where should we put our ever stretched resources? You might have your own business needs, of course, but if you're looking at a global region and where to start, I would say that China should jump out at you and be a strong consideration to make sure that you've got your portfolio and your best practices put together. Now we're going to dig into the elephant in the room, so to speak. We're going to throw some facts at you about Alibaba. So when it comes to online brand protection, working with or working against or in some capacity with Alibaba is something that you will eventually do. There may be some of you on the phone that working with Alibaba to remove infringement for your brand is old hat. There may be some of you on the phone where this is your first kind of foray into brand protection, and as you're trying to figure out where to go first, Alibaba should be probably the highest on your radar. So they account for a huge percentage of all online sales in China. They have a huge annual revenue growth. They are, expanding worldwide. Just before we jumped on the call, Trevor and I were having a conversation about, Jack Ma and the Alibaba Group making strides here into the United States. We'll touch on some of their other cross-border sales here in another slide or two. But one thing that we found interesting that we wanted to highlight is they've done a lot of major offline acquisitions. So when we talk online brand protection, certainly obviously you're focused in the online space and removing those infringements, but often you really need to make sure that your online program is paired with a very strong and robust offline program. And so as China moves in, as Alibaba moves in and makes some major offline acquisitions, a $2.6 billion one of In-Time Retail, which is one of the largest retail chains in China, you can see that Alibaba is setting themselves up to control the supply chain and can kind of control the purchasing streams of all the brands and probably yours included. 4.5 billion revenue, 450 million active buyers on Chinese marketplaces. They have a majority stake in another marketplace with a few locales called Lazada. If you're not familiar with that particular marketplace, I would encourage you to do a little investigating. They have a large active presence on there as well. So now I think we've kind of, I would say, shown every stat and statistic that would show why you would want to pay attention to China, and then make sure that you're looking, in the online space, making sure you've got that offline program, and then making sure that you're set up appropriately on Alibaba, as they are the most popular and they're still the elephant in the room. So moving into some opportunities and challenges. China is interesting. So normally when we talk, online brand protection, we are talking about the production of counterfeits, the often used phrase of the third shift, where your potential legitimate manufacturers unfortunately start producing some of those infringing items. Maybe it's raids. There's a number of things that are usually topics of conversation with China. But as we look and we help brand owners, one of the things that we really have started to focus on, and we found to be very helpful, is turning those challenges into opportunities in the market. So we've set up that, when it comes to e-commerce, China is a huge player. In fact, they're the biggest player. So what we found is that, China, while of course they are manufacturing these counterfeit goods that we want to remove, they're also the world's workshop for legitimate goods. And, as you look internally at your own brands, it's very possible that you have, a lot of legitimate products coming from China and a lot of illegitimate products coming from China. And so what we found to be, a good tool is to take a look and see if there's any business or product opportunities within those infringements to turn them into positive. And what I mean by that is we've had one particular brand that we worked with for a very long time. They have used our data to track where the most infringements are coming from. And if there's infringements that are moving into areas where they don't have a presence, then they're able to take that to their marketing group. They're able to take that to their product team, their biz dev, and say, hey, there's a ton of infringement here, which means we're very popular and we don't have any product. So let's go ahead and develop a strategy. Let's work together to move into that space. So as you look at the Chinese market, it's most certainly a challenge, and we're going to leave you with some key takeaways on how to overcome that. You want to always be thinking, how can I take these challenges and turn them into opportunities for the business? So, that multi-million-dollar problem can turn into a multi-million or billion-dollar, potential profit center for you and your company. Looking outside of the Chinese market, and this particular slide, I think is very interesting. I had I was the good fortune of attending an event 2 weeks ago with 50+ brand owners, and hearing the feedback that they had, especially in regards to China. And one of the main conversations that they were having is, how is the Chinese market influencing and impacting other markets around the globe? And so, within MarkMonitor, and you certainly should as well, you're kind of always looking, to the future. So if you think you have a good handle on, the Chinese market right now, where's the next move? And so I wanted to spend, just a few minutes kind of highlighting the Chinese market's impact on Russia. So 15.7 billion in retail e-commerce, 37% growth in cross-border trade for 6% local. So there you have a huge uptick in e-commerce, and you can see by that bottom stat, the bottom two stats, 1/3 of it is coming from foreign companies, and 90% of goods purchased abroad are coming from China. So if you're looking at your particular brand protection strategy, and you're very focused on China, which you should be, you want to make sure that you don't have a blind spot to how China is influencing some of those other markets. And then a quick bar chart on the right, you can see that the most visited e-commerce website in Russia is actually an Alibaba site. So I don't find that very surprising, Trevor, by the look on your face. It doesn't look like you find that very surprising either. So again, we just always like to try to present, the most current information, what folks in the industry are talking about, and the Chinese market impact on Russia is certainly one of them. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Trevor to talk about some brand protection and enforcement strategy. Certainly, kind of stay engaged. As Ian mentioned, we'll have another poll coming up here in just a few slides.
So I think we're going to start off with an example here that is going to definitely kind of play out through the different best practices and examples that we give. So we want to kind of put this case up front so you can see different opportunities that are presented as we kind of give you some advice on how to manage these types of situations and ideally how to avoid them in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. So we wanted to put, one of the most popular examples of, kind of how you can unintentionally miss in a brand protection strategy. And then, Trevor will go into all of the things that you can do to help avoid this situation. So this particular one is very famous. If you haven't heard of it, in Michael Jordan, he has, his own brand. He's, probably the most popular global athlete. Back in 1984 in China, they translated his name into some Chinese characters and some Chinese phrases. A company then went and registered basically everything Michael Jordan related with that transliteration. You can see there on the top right, they went as far as to register his son's name. They registered in Roman and Chinese characters. They really took all of his kind of stock of intellectual property and they turned it into what is essentially a knockoff Jordan brand. But the way that China works, and Trevor will get into more of this in detail, is, first to file rules the day. They were there in first, knowing your other brand name. So the Jordan brand and Jumpman 23, red, black, white, the Bulls, all of those things that are associated with Jordan, they were able to capitalize on. And then iterations and other intellectual property. So the Jumpman logo is very famous. If you look over here to the right, you can see that they switched it up a little bit. They still use 23, some of the other iconic kind of positions that that Jordan likes to show. So the Jordan brand has been fighting this Chinese knockoff brand forever. And as we'll get into, the intellectual property fight when it comes to Chinese companies can be very challenging. So the Jordan brand has brought 78 cases on this particular company, and they've only won 3. So they were in there first, they registered the trademarks, they found the gaps the Jordan brand had in their trademark portfolio, and they were able to get in there. So they've only won 3. They did have a big one in 2016. They decided that Jordan owns the right to his own name. So that you can see in its own is that big of a challenge. He had to fight and fight and fight to say, I am Michael Jordan, recognize me as Michael Jordan, I am the Jordan brand. And lately, within the past few months, the sportswear company, they are now suing Michael Jordan and the Jordan brand because the Jordan litigating against them has made it challenging for them to do business. So if you kind of take a step back, this is the situation that we're in. They missed on some intellectual property registrations, and now they have a company that explicitly and upfront uses the Jordan brand to conduct their business. And now they are saying the legitimate Jordan brand makes it challenging for me to do business in China. So if, I just saying that out loud, I rolled my eyes a little bit. I can only imagine the reaction on the phone. So there were a number of things that in this particular instance, knowing what we know in some of these best practices, they could have avoided, some of this headache. So we wanted to set an example up front, that kind of shows what can happen if you don't do the things that Trevor's about to jump into.
Yeah, definitely. First lesson, I guess, will be as soon as your brand starts to gain popularity in China, they will give it a Chinese name, consumers and the media. And if you haven't done it first, someone will do it for you. So we'll get into more of that later. But, all the times that Zach and I have sat down and gone over different things that brands are experiencing in China and what we've done for them and what we'd like to do for them, we still kind of get things boiled down to these main themes. So we'll be talking a lot about the role technology plays and how you can use that to do things like understanding the landscape and also using that landscape information to prioritize your enforcement. The importance of a regional presence, we'll spend quite a bit of time on that. But the first thing you have to start thinking about is building a strong IP portfolio. So after we talk a bit about the technology, we will go in depth on how you're going to be able to do that. So technology, volume is the first thing that comes to mind when we think of the different tools that help us get through just the massive amount of stuff that's out there. So whether you have a long-standing brand that has really saturated both the legit and illicit market, or you're just getting started, it's hard, if not impossible, to really understand the full scope of your problem without using technology. We'll start with detection. So first, being able to find everything that's out there. And with detection, and when you see how much is there, it's easy to get overwhelmed. And doing this manually is possible, but the volume will eventually catch up to you and kill you. So being able to keep up with the volume, understanding that for every enforcement, there's follow-up and there is follow-through based on the kind of feedback you get from the various marketplaces. Those all take time. So having an efficient way to manage all those cases is absolutely critical. The Chinese market and it being a complicated enforcement process or having complicated enforcement processes is an understatement. And most of the main platforms that we work with, so the Alibaba group, their various platforms, they generally have technology-based IP reporting systems. So being able to interface directly with those systems to be able to submit takedowns efficiently and have kind of more real-time feedback from the market is going to be critical. So also reporting is key. And so when we talk about first benchmarking, we've understand the scope of the problem by using technology to kind of fill out the landscape. But how are you going to report successes or show that what you're doing is impactful? technology there is going to help you articulate all your successes internally. And I think that's one good way of kind of bringing the brand protection program and all the successes and opportunities that come with it more into the light for your organization if you have a tool that's letting you call up that information quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. And Trevor, one of the things that you mentioned that I think is an important topic is just the massive scope of infringement, right? So when we start with a particular brand and we're helping build their program, it can be a little overwhelming when we try to look at the landscape. So one of the things that we have found to be very, very helpful is to say, okay, we really want to protect let's say the well-intentioned consumer, right? We want to protect the customer that is a fan of our brand, is an advocate for our brand, that is looking to have a legitimate experience with our brand when they go online. And so if you have technology that is, kind of focused in the areas where people look when they actually buy something. So I know for myself, if I don't find it in the first 2 or 3 things, I'm probably doing a different search. I'm not hoping that on page 100, I, stumble across some kind of relevant result. So, having some purpose-built technology that says, we can go where the consumers go first, and then we can take a look at the infringement. I think that can be very helpful for brands. And then the second piece is just making sure that whatever technology you're using is giving you an accurate picture, of the landscape. And so you want to make sure that you're leveraging, IP proxy networks and some other, technology pieces that say, when I do a search, if I do a search from here in Boise, Idaho, on some of these marketplaces that are very specifically focused in the Chinese market, I might not get a good landscape of what those consumers are actually looking for and what they're actually purchasing. So, the leveraging technology that can really help you hone in on consumers and then hone in on that local base. And then again, as you mentioned, you flip that right into the reporting and you can show that success back to the business. That's a pretty good start. That's a good way to look at it, most certainly.
Yeah, and as much as we'd like to think we can, we're not going to be able to clean up the entire internet. So by removing listings that are most likely to impact those, as you called them, like well-intentioned consumers, that you need technology to do it. So we're going to have another poll here before we jump into maybe the most important part of the best practices.
Yeah, thanks, guys. So at this point, we thought it'd be interesting to hear from everyone on the phone of your experience managing an IP portfolio in China and where you are in your efforts. So here's the basic question. How strong is your IP portfolio in China? Are you non-existent, which is maybe where the Jordan brand was a few years back, or all the way through to robust, or you're not sure, it's not applicable? Give us a few more seconds. We've got some responses coming in. And it was kind of interesting to hear what the Jordan brand experience. I know Zach and Trevor are about to give you some best practices, but as of today, where do you think you are? Okay, 2 more seconds for a couple more responses. And here's the results. Looks like a lot of you think you're okay. Some don't know. And a few people say, yeah, they're non-existent or it needs work. And I think that's where Zach and Trevor, you can help. And so let's move right along as time's marching on here to hear how people can strengthen their IP portfolio.
Thanks, Ian. Yeah, and based off that poll, I can say that it's never too late to get started and there's always room for improvement. So I think that covers every respondent there. So this is the number one thing out of, I think, any of the other points we're going to talk about that is going to have the biggest impact in determining the success of your program. If you haven't started building your portfolio yet, now is the time to start. And those of you who have portfolios that are somewhere in between, hopefully some of these tips will kind of help you shore them up a bit and make sure that you're working with as much ammunition as possible when you go after your problem. So engaging with local resources to verify the strength of your trademark rights. Many people are not as protected as they think they are, just because we get so used to the international trademark classes that we're familiar with working with. But when you start moving to different geographies, China specifically, you're going to find that they have their own way of doing things, with their own application and classification systems, and being first to file. You have to take a different approach. And to kind of know where you stand, the best way to do that is to have local legal representation or IP experts take a look at where you are and where you might want to head if you're going to be effective in protecting your brand in China. So a big thing we can start out with is copyright. Copyright is a way that we leverage much of what we get down on these marketplaces. The concept in itself is fairly new in China, so there is some seller unfamiliarity with it, but there is a lot of rampant deliberate abuse, and that's one of the things that we try to curb first when we kind of enter the market for enforcement. So I think newer brands are maybe a bit more guilty of this than some of the more established ones, but if your brand is seasonal and you're constantly changing the material on your website, if you have a product line that's evolving pretty quickly, this is very important that you know who is keeping records of the copyrighted material that you've been publishing and knowing how to access those, so that when you go to these marketplaces, the first thing they're going to ask for is evidence that you've used it and where they can see it. And so any copyright enforcement that we send is going to be kind of based on the ability to show the marketplace that you used it legitimately first. So being good stewards of your documentation, knowing who owns those reference copyright materials, and of course, trademarks. For trademarks, we often need original color copies, all that good stuff. So knowing where those live and who is in charge of keeping them, that's all very important, and it's going to help you stay on top of other critical things like making sure that there is appropriate change documentation along with those. Businesses change with their names, their addresses. All of that needs to be carefully documented because, like I said, with copyright, any enforcement that we send or that you send, we need to be able to draw a very clear path of ownership between the intellectual property and the person who's submitting the enforcements. And so have that proof of authorization, keep it all together. And this is actually another good opportunity to reach out to other partners within your business. We see that some of this stuff lives in marketing, some of it might live in a different department. So kind of grow your brand protection network internally when you're kind of vetting where you stand and where everything lives for your organization.
Yeah, that's a great point, Trevor. And I think that bottom one, the proof of authorization for trademarks under a different company name is really important, right? So in this kind of era of, acquisitions and mergers and, these longtime brands, over time, they can, absorb different companies. We'll engage with one, part of the business and they say, oh, we're, company X, here's our trademark. And then when we move into a different region, especially China, maybe some others, it's, oh, that's actually managed by a subsidiary of this company who is a subsidiary of this company. And so it can be, kind of they like to make you jump through the hoops to prove that authorization. So the easier you make it to draw that line, as Trevor mentioned, is certainly helpful. We've seen some roadblocks where people aren't quite sure, who has the authorization or the power to engage, what some of these important marks. So again, Trevor, that's a great point.
And to be focused on China, I also want to mention we kind of have to pull back and think of it as a region as well. Mm-hmm. So we look at China, but we're also, you need to assess how strong your rights are in Hong Kong, Macau, Taiwan, just because it is all related, kind of how Zach showed with his example with Russia. These goods are moving between these different countries, and you want to make sure you're protected to stop them at any point within that group. So understanding scope and prioritizing enforcement. One thing that we see a lot of is a failure to separate your business problems and have separate strategies for addressing each. So separating out what might be a gray market issue that ties into distribution networks out from what is counterfeit. you'll be doing yourself a lot of favors to separate them kind of in your mind and in your processes. So you need to make sure you know what your problem actually is, and things like using that technology to fully understand the landscape. That's where kind of the size and nature of your problem is going to be revealed. And to be a moving target, you need to take a consumer-centric approach. And we've touched on this a couple times, where you need to be looking where your well-intentioned shoppers are trying to find your goods. There's always going to be more hidden, deep, dark, 150 pages deep on some of these marketplaces, but that's not where people going to buy legitimate versions of your goods are going to be looking. I hate to even use the phrase, but whack-a-mole. So there is a very important component of whack-a-mole, which is constantly creating awareness about your intellectual property rights and your brand protection efforts that are going to deter both current and would-be infringers of your brand. So regularly delisting, cleaning up the marketplaces, and at the same time, all of that generates awareness. So eventually infringers are going to choose an easier target when they know that you're out there policing your brand. And then again, separating your problems for what they are. So breaking out the counterfeit from the gray market, or distribution problems with legitimate goods. And then that balancing act that comes down. So we know that there are always limited resources, especially kind of in the brand protection area. And so you have to balance that regular delisting to maintain brand awareness and taking care of the most egregious infringements, but also looking after high value targets and ways to pursue them.
And I think, Trevor, when it comes to whack-a-mole, I heard the other day, enforcement fatigue. I kind of like that. I like that one a little bit. And there was a great quote, and I apologize, I can't remember who to attribute this to. So if it's you, shoot me an email. But you don't have an issue with whack-a-mole if you kill all the moles, right? So those regular delistings, while it may seem like it's a challenge, they really impact the market. And we'll show in one of our case studies just how influential it can be to move those infringers off your brand by taking that action.
Yeah, and so because you won't be able to kill every mole, at least not right off the bat, you need to be able to adapt and evolve with them. So it's definitely a cat and mouse game for a lot of these sellers, and for a lot of different brands, where as they become more familiar with our enforcement strategies, they are going to change their behavior. So while we do want them to change their behavior in the long run to stop infringing your brand, in the near term, we can start with getting them to stop using copyrighted imagery, to discontinue the use of your actual trademarks. And that's when things like having patents to complement those trademarks and copyrights come in handy, to kind of go after the more difficult cases that tend to be what's left after we clean up the most obvious infringements. More within the last year, I think, than any previous year, are marketplaces coming out with their own programs to kind of bring brand owners into the fold, show that they are empathetic to concerns, and find ways to allow brand owners certain liberties in searching or reporting different types of infringement. So our recommendation is to participate in those programs as they become available to you, but with managed expectations. So don't expect the next marketplace program you get invited to kind of be a panacea for all of your problems, but it could go a long way in just building that relationship and familiarity of your brand within the marketplace. So we do encourage you to join those and enjoy the insight that comes with kind of being in there. And then looking at your own distribution partners as well. So start now, trying to figure out and get control of where these goods are heading and how they're being distributed. I've seen authorized seller lists, out of control in by the thousands. And what happens is, as these authorizations keep getting diluted through, this guy authorizes next door, but eventually what you see is authentic product mixed with counterfeit at a certain level. And once that starts to spread, it's very difficult to control. So look over your distribution agreements and tighten them and enforce them. And then again, maintaining separate goals and strategies for gray market versus counterfeit. We've talked quite a bit about that. Set realistic goals that prioritize making a counterfeit version of your product hard to find by consumers. So when I say realistic goals, there's a tendency to start looking at the number of things that you take down off of Marketplace each month as the be-all, end-all, but it's certainly not. And it goes a long way to keep in mind that we're interested in what your counterfeit problem looks like in a year after making several strategic moves in that time. So try not to get hung up on the, both the challenges and the kind of numbers that are flooding out on a monthly or weekly basis, even as you check. So keep bigger picture in mind, I think is where I was going.
Yeah, and that's a great point. So, one of the things that we often show brand owners is the way that we're able to impact seller behavior. So if we're looking on, any of the Chinese marketplaces, when we first engage with a brand, or if it's been, a brand who has been doing brand protection, for some time and then, chooses to work with us, we like to show how we impact the market. And so, not only is, are we removing those products, which is great, and then there are some enforcement and compliance components to it, but also highlighting how sellers are forced to abandon trademark and title, how they're forced to abandon copyright image, how they are basically reduced to listing your particular product in a way where it's totally disassociated with the actual legitimate version. So if I'm a customer and I go on and I'm potentially looking for an athletic jersey, and the listing is so obscured to where I wouldn't even use those search terms and I would never find that product, that I think is a realistic goal, for success, where if we've made all the bad guys abandoned all of the things that would draw traffic to their listing and then allow them to profit, I think that's a great goal. If you cut off the revenue stream to those infringers, they're going to go to a different brand. They're just going to counterfeit someone else. Maybe it's one of your competitors. I don't know. But I think, having a kind of a good idea of changing that seller behavior and what that really means is a really great point.
So having local partners is going to be key for some of the reasons we mentioned earlier about, you can't just register in English. Obviously, with the Jordan example, you need to be registering in simplified traditional transliterations as well as translations as possible. And that's best accomplished with local partners who speak the language, understand the culture, and can give you a better idea of what a cohesive brand looks like in the Chinese space, and what you need to do to keep that brand cohesive. So we're fortunate here at MarkMonitor, kind of the beating heart of our Chinese operations is in Shanghai. And that team of partners are able to meet with the Alibaba group bi-weekly to discuss various concerns and shifting marketplace policies. So by engaging with somebody who's already invested significantly in building those relationships is going to be key. Relationship building is absolutely essential in doing business in China, and has a whole range of different meanings than it does in doing business in the West. So recognizing that difference and then finding someone who's already familiar, who knows how to navigate some of the nuance involved, it's going to make you much more likely to find success in China. And then being attuned to the ever-changing landscape. So you're not going to get an email every time that a marketplace changes their policy on, say, like a 3 strikes policy for infringers, or they will no longer be accepting, this country's IP to leverage to enforce. And you're going to find that kind of information by staying in tune with legal journals, blogs, webinars like this one, anything that lets you kind of know what's happening on the ground before it's already affecting you. And I think next we have an example just really quickly of some legislation that was being pushed through the Chinese courts, but you would not be aware of this unless you were looking at Chinese law blogs and legal journals to notice this that could potentially have a big impact on marketplace policy. And this is an example of information that you can use to take to marketplaces eventually and hold them accountable. But you have to know what's going on to kind of jump on these opportunities. So it was a lot in a brief period of time, but we're going to try and tie that to some specific examples.
Sure. And, Trevor, I think you did a great job of sort of partitioning the things that they should focus on, right? So the building the IP portfolio, and I am in total agreement with you that that's the most important. It's impossible to have a successful brand protection strategy if you don't have, the IP to protect your brand. And then, moving into the different ways you measure success, having the different strategies, what can you declare victory on? And then finally moving into those partnerships. So, we work with a lot of brands that say, hey, I do a really good job on these marketplaces in the West or in different regions. I don't have the same success in China. Why? Because you can't just pick up what you do in that area and apply it to China. It just doesn't work that way. So, we're fortunate enough to be able to leverage that local presence, but, ideally that is a best practice for all the folks. So here are a couple, we're going to move through a number of case studies and really kind of tie in all of those best practices in ways that they worked. A couple of these will also be ways that they didn't work. So however you recognize your brand in these particular scenarios, kind of take that to heart. If I read one of these and, you kind of get the thought bubble that says, I'm not sure when our most important Chinese trademark is up for renewal, maybe go and check that. Or if you listen and you're like, no, I actually have a really good, kind of library of our copyrighted image and we're leveraging that successfully, then, give yourself a little pat on the back. So the first one, I won't spend too much time on it. This is similar to, the Jordan brand and some of the others where a particular apparel company was very, very popular. They had a pretty robust IP portfolio. They covered all the right products that they needed. And, some folks in China, of course, being first to file, kind of looked through the holes in their IP and they registered some trademarks and products that they didn't make. Now, I'm not suggesting that you can somehow look into a crystal ball and know exactly what's going to happen and know exactly what the counterfeiters are going to do, but it does hold, some weight to be able to look and say, okay, we make these goods. I'm monitoring this particular space and I'm starting to see these products creep up that we don't make. Maybe a local distributor has reached out to me via email and said, hey, do we make cell phone cases or whatever it might be? And if the answer is no, then you really need to take a quick look at your IP portfolio. So this particular brand was able, through those relationships and partnerships, kind of take care of that non-existent product issue. But you need to have your pulse, you need to have your hand on the pulse of the local market because they will start making products that you don't and registering your local IP. The second one that we see here, and this one I know is near and dear to Trevor's heart, as he is the grand champion of building your IP portfolio. We had a brand that unfortunately let one of their major trademarks in China, they let the renewal certificate lapse. And so, we were able to do a number of other things to make sure that they were protected. But, the Chinese trademark office certainly does not move at the speed that I think brand owners, would like them to. So it was quite a process for them to get the renewal certificates and for us to kind of get them back on board. So if you have major trademarks and you're not sure when their renewal expires, or you think you do, but you haven't checked in a while, we can't encourage you enough to go and take a look, make sure you've got that documentation in order, make sure that it's in the hand of, your vendors, whoever you partner with. Just having that documentation is so key. We really impress upon that point.
Yeah, and even if it's a near miss, if we're made aware of things in advance, we can actually do a lot to help you out.
Sure.
And that goes for both IP and your product. So if you're aware that you're going to miss a renewal or there's going to be a lapse of a couple of months and we only have a couple of weeks, to continue to leverage that trademark, that's where you want to put your focus, is on what you have while you have it. So things that you don't have, new products that haven't launched yet, we found that brand owners that keep us in the loop on when things are going to release opens up tremendous opportunities to enforce on the grounds of things that you aren't currently selling or making. So there have been a couple examples where because we are aware of the new product launches and all the associated dates, we can predict what we're going to be seeing on the marketplaces and when we're going to be seeing it, and already have a plan in place to mitigate those situations or be there to prevent any risk when those times come. And here is a good example of changing seller behavior. So we were able to leverage a lot of good copyrighted imagery to remove many of these listings, and eventually you see seller behavior changing from, say, that top row down, we're down to a stack of t-shirts, and eventually we're blurring out logos entirely, and so they have to find these sort of undercover ways of advertising the brand and that it's counterfeit. And that's the type of kind of disassociation we look for. And here there was a world famous apparel brand with a very famous symbol, which not surprisingly started ending up on all kinds of things in China. They were having difficulty making the case that they did have the relevant protections, and because of our partnerships with Alibaba, that those regular meetings, having a team that deals with kind of tough situations, we were kind of able to get everybody at the table and put enough perspective on it that I think all parties involved, we all knew what the issue was, and we were fortunately able to work through it with Alibaba for that brand owner. And I talked earlier or mentioned keeping marketplaces accountable. And so by joining the various programs and by understanding their policies, you are able to kind of leverage that information if they're not acting in a way that's in line with what they say they're doing. So here's an example of where every enforcement was tracked very carefully for this exact purpose. So the 3-strike policy, they were tracking time, the different targets, how long it was taking for things to come down. And they were able to bring this to Alibaba and say, hey, these are the sellers that stepped out of your policy. Can you punish them in line with your policy?
And, as Trevor alluded to earlier, about making sure that you are doing your due diligence when it comes to removing infringement. Here is an apparel company that we work with. You can see in the chart, January through May, that was before they engaged with us. And then when they engaged with us on the Chinese marketplaces, you see the giant spike. The few things that I want to call out here is that what we have found with the brands that we work with is once we find an infringer, after 1 month, about 88% of them drop off. They are tired of having their revenue cut. They're tired of having their listings. They have to repost their listings. They're just tired, so they move to another brand. And then as we work down the line, 2 months, 3 months, 4, you're always going to have those guys that either have a ton of inventory or they are just, and they're just dedicated to infringing on your brand. And then you certainly need to have, some of the other services, the high value targeting and investigative reports that we mentioned. But what we really want to highlight here is that not only is the amount of total sellers being removed, but the amount of new sellers that are engaging on infringing your brand also lessens. So the word gets out. People don't want to, come after your brand from an infringement standpoint because they know their listings are going to get removed, and that's incredibly, frustrating. Even a brand that's seasonal, so this particular one is, so you can see an uptick towards the end of the year. That uptick is less than the initial spike in enforcement. So you can impact sellers, you can chase them away from your brand, you can make it very hard. You just have to, as Trevor mentioned, continue to do your due diligence, focus where the consumers are, and you always need that strong IP portfolio to do so. Once infringers, they're going to use a bunch of different tactics to list their listings once we start enforcing. So again, here is just if you have that strong portfolio, you can see copyrighted image dropping, brand confusion dropping, counterfeit dropping, logo dropping, design registration dropping. Those are all tools, if you have the right IP, that we can leverage to enforce. And eventually it all drops down and to the right, because those infringers are just simply tired of relisting and trying to engage in that infringement.
Yeah, and I'll use that as one more chance to point out.
Sure.
Both those great examples are looking at the bigger picture and seeing how things are accomplished over a period of months and years, as opposed to becoming too narrowly focused in the short term.
Yeah, that's a great point, Trevor.
So hopefully by now we've made a pretty good case for why China matters. So we've got that massive global footprint for counterfeit goods that are coming out of China in the region. But on the other side of that coin is just this huge consumer market opportunity for your business to go in and make legitimate room for your products and services by clearing out the illegitimate. And then revenue, just a tremendous growth opportunity for any business. At the end of the day, if you want to sell anything and you want to sell that online with some success, then you need to be interested in China.
Yep. And as we've touched on plenty, the Chinese market brings those opportunities, but it brings challenges. And don't get discouraged. If you're new to protecting your brand in the space, or you've been doing it, a long time, each part of that life cycle can bring its own challenges. But if you're leveraging technology, you're leveraging, experienced partners, those regional, folks that can help with the nuance, all of the things that Trevor and I have mentioned, don't get discouraged, just keep after it. And then acquire the expertise. So when you do get a challenge, if you're not quite sure how to beat it, rather than giving up, there are folks out there that can help you, kind of overcome that. And finally, partner. We can't say this enough, that, the one strategy in one area of the world might not necessarily or won't translate right to China. You need to have that local experience that can engage with the marketplaces, that can advocate and leverage for your brand. So again, a couple key takeaways there. So Ian, I know we have just a few minutes left. Trevor and I are happy to answer any questions that might have come in, and most certainly if we don't get to your question today, Trevor and I are happy to follow up.
Yeah, thanks very much, Zach and Trevor. We're now ready to open it up to your questions. We are at the top of the hour, but if you're able to stay on the line, you can hear the responses live, or don't forget, we've got a recording we'll be sending you a link to, so you can always check back if you have to go to another meeting. As a quick reminder, if you have any questions, submit them via the Q&A button on the top of the screen. And we've had a couple of interesting questions come in already. One is that a person's emailed or in the Q&A box has said, we have registered word trademarks in China for a number of brand names in both English and Chinese characters. The question is, when applying for copyrights on our labels of popular brands sold in China, should we include both English and Chinese characters, or should we file copyrights on our USA labels and a separate copyright filing on our Chinese labels?
That is a great question. So to enforce in China, you don't need to have registered copyrights, but that hasn't stopped bad actors to try and register them for you. So I would say being proactive about registering in both English and Chinese, both separately in China and the English in the US or elsewhere, is a good idea.
Okay. Second question that just came in is a two-part question, really. First one is maybe a little loaded. Is Alibaba really cleaning up its act? And they go on to say, also, will only Chinese rights result in notice and takedown, or will they, presumably Alibaba, act on the basis of a US trademark or copyright?
So Trevor, maybe I'll take the first part and you can handle the second part. So I most certainly don't want to give them too much credit, but I would say, Trevor and I have been doing this a long time, and the cooperation that the Alibaba group has, not only to brand owners, but to folks like ourselves, has improved. It used to be on some of their properties, Taobao.com, for example, that it was borderline impossible to get anything removed. It was just a ton of work to get, the foot in the door, get them to communicate, all of the things that we've mentioned. But now with the Good Faith program, with Market Safe, what we actually do is, we work with, our system and our data, and also help our, our brands engage with some of those other external, programs that they have, and we kind of combine all that data together. And what we've seen and our relationships with them, they're getting better. Are they where they need to be? Absolutely not. I think Taobao might have just got relisted on the AAFA notorious market list, or they were very close. So they're not perfect. They're certainly, an entity that you need to be aware of and continue to engage and push and leverage to make better choices. But I would say overall they're better than they were, and they tend to be trending in a better direction. And as Alibaba continues their kind of global expansion into different channels, the pressure for them to get better, I think, will increase. And as long as brand owners are continuing to pressure them, as they have been in the past, I would expect continued improvement.
Yeah, before you get to the second part of the question, there's actually a follow-up from that same person. They say, yes, we'd heard Alibaba would act for big companies that paid for the privilege, but smaller players, SMEs, were not as responsive, if at all. What do you say about that?
That's interesting. So, we work with brands of all sizes. I would say from the biggest of the biggest enterprise to new apparel companies, that are just starting out. And as long as you engage them in the right way up front, some of the challenges that we found is if you're not quite sure what you're doing and you send errant enforcement up front, then they're less likely to work with you, so on and so forth. But for the most part, we've seen them, kind of engage equally. Now, if you are a major brand and you are, if Alibaba is making lots of revenue off the selling of your brand, my guess is, they might have their ear, a little more than a small to medium-sized business. But if you're trying to engage them on enforcements and they don't seem to be listening, that would be, I would like to do some follow-up on that, because I think that is a place where we could help.
Yeah,
okay, and then the second part of the question was, Chinese rights result in notice and takedown, or will they act on a U.S. trademark or copyright?
Yep, so they will act on international copyrights, and Alibaba will accept U.S. trademarks. If you want to enforce on Taobao or Tmall or the other kind of inward-facing Chinese marketplaces, then you're going to need registered Chinese trademark certificates.
And with those certificates, Trevor, isn't there some additional kind of layers they put on that when you sign up brands, right?
You need a execute. Yeah. So that's where knowing where your original color copies come in. Not having those just opens up a whole different set of hoops that we have to jump through to kind of establish your brand with these various marketplaces. And I mean, that does still kind of tie into the question of who will Alibaba kind of play with. Our job is to establish trust between your brand and the system. And like Zach had said, we've done that for brands of all sizes. So I definitely wouldn't be hesitant to get involved today because you think you might not have as much weight to throw around as you do.
Yep, great point.
Okay, we've got time probably for a couple more. Somebody here is asking, what about when you're selling a service brand and not a product? Do the same rules apply?
Yeah, so treating service marks, it's much different. So I know our presentation is focused on counterfeit and talked a bit about gray market and diversion. There is some recourse built into their IP reporting world now, as far as trade dress for services, service marks, you can enforce. It's just going to be more difficult. And oftentimes we have to tie those to other types of infringement, like copyright or trademark abuse, for infringing on those services.
Okay, I think we'll wrap it up with one last question then. You mentioned the importance of local partnerships. So how would this person say, how would they go about picking one to make sure it's reputable?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think there's a number of ways that you can do it. Certainly, industry groups are a great resource for referrals. We are, MarkMonitor is involved in a number of industry groups, and we are often, recommended, or often within those groups, we hear companies refer investigators or refer maybe, test buys or partners, or there's a whole kind of, there's lots of different channels where you could go with a referral. So I think industry groups are one. If you have peers that face a similar problem, maybe they're a competitor in the business world, but when it comes to brand protection, maybe you can find an ally. They're another great resource. And then, most certainly, a company like us, we have, our own relationship and referral teams that can help, set up, those additional partnerships. So look to the industry, look to your peers, and then, if you do use a vendor like MarkMonitor, they should be able to give you a trusted referral with, whatever channel you might need.
Okay, thanks. Well, I think at this point we better draw a line under the questions. A couple more have come in, but we'll get back to you individually on those. And I'd like to thank Zach and Trevor. We appreciate sharing all this information, best practices with our audience. And I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in, for their participation in the polls and the questions. And as a reminder, we'll be sending out a follow-up email with a link to today's webinar and the recording, both the slides and the recording over the next couple of days. So be on the lookout for that. And that concludes our webinar for today. Thanks everybody again for tuning in, and have a great day.